Hello and welcome to Topic 3, Lecture 1, and in this topic we're going to be learning about federalism. So what are we going to cover in this lecture? Well, first we're going to define the concept of federalism. Then we're going to look at the ways in which power can be divided within a country, since federalism is just one way that power can be divided. And then we're going to look at federalism and how it's outlined in the Constitution. So let's get started. Your textbook defines federalism as a system of government in which power is divided by a constitution between a central government and regional governments. Another way of thinking about what federalism is that it's the division of power within the United States between the national government, Congress, the presidency, and the states. So federalism is this power-sharing relationship. No one government has all of the power in the United States. That power is shared between the national government and the states, and that power-sharing relationship is outlined in the Constitution. Now, federalism is just one way for how a country could divide power within its territory. And so there are different ways that power can be divided within a territory. And in this section of the lecture, we're going to take a look at the different ways that power can be divided. We're going to take a look at the unitary system for dividing power, the confederal system of dividing power, and then the kind of system that we have in the United States, which is the federal system for dividing power. Okay, so the first system that we're going to take a look at is what's known as the unitary system for dividing government. And on the side here, you'll see a graph, okay? And so, or I guess a pie, some pies. And so on the big purple outer circle is the national government. And then you'll notice that the state government is inside the power of the national government, and local governments are even further within inside this arrangement. And this is a good illustration of what the unitary system for dividing power sort of looks like. So what the unitary system for dividing power is where the national government is sovereign. The national government is the government that has almost all of the power. And it delegates that power, the national government delegates its power to the subnational units. They might be called states, they might be called landers, they might be called provinces. There are different words that are used for those subnational units. But at the end of the day, the national government is sovereign and the states don't have a lot of autonomy. The state and local governments are really just there not to make laws and decisions that are unique to their state or province, but really just to take national law and put it into action. And this kind of system for dividing power really centralizes power in the hands of the national government. And so France is a good example of a unitary system. The French national government makes decisions, and then the subunits within France put those decisions into action. And so sort of a joke about the French system is that, like, if you look at that France will set the national school curriculum. And so that, the joke is that you could, look at the calendar, you could say, okay, it's October 30th, whatever it is. And we know that every second grade student is reading this particular book or working on this certain set of math problems. Okay. It's really top down. In the United States, obviously, our power is much more diffused than that. As we're going to learn in this lecture, states have a lot of autonomy and control over certain things. Curriculum, schooling is one of those powers that is reserved to the states. Now, you can kind of understand why the framers did not choose the unitary system as the way to divide power within the United States, because they were really worried that if the national government had all of the power or most of the power, it would be more likely that that power would be abused. And so you might say, well, what are some of the benefits of the unitary system of government? Well, one benefit is that since there aren't these checks and balances between the national government and the state governments, it's easier to get things done, right? If the national government think that it's something that should be done, then it's easier to have that done and have that policy be uniformly applied across the nation, regardless of what state or province you live in. In the United States, we see that there's differences in terms of policies from one state to another. Let me give a concrete example. In the United States, that states get to decide their criminal penalties. So that while some states use the death penalty as an ultimate punishment for murder, other states choose not to. So there's some differences between the states. There's differences in terms of certain social policies, differences in terms of curriculum, differences in terms of criminal law. And so while that flexibility might be a good thing, it could also be like, hey, I committed murder in one state, I'm going to get the death penalty, but if I committed it in another state, I don't get the death penalty, which might lead to some sense of unfairness or unequal justice. The next method for dividing power is one that you're going to be familiar with. It is known as the confederal system for dividing power within a territory. And you're familiar with that because in topic 2, we learned about the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And our first Constitution of the United States divided power according to a confederal system. And so as the diagram illustrates there, that in a confederal system, it's the states that have the most power. The states are supreme. And as we learned by learning about the Articles of Confederation, the national government is really a servant of the states, okay? As you know from the Articles of Confederation, the national government, there was only one institution of government, Congress. It had very limited powers, and it really couldn't do a lot without the almost unanimous authority or consent of the states. And so the national government is a creation and a servant of the states. States are equal partners in decision making, and we know that from the Articles of Confederation. And it's oftentimes known as sort of a league of friendship, okay, where where the states kind of come together in some sort of league in order to make decisions, with the national government again having very limited power. Now we know why the framers or why the founders who created the Articles of Confederation, we know why they chose the Confederation, because they were really nervous about giving power to a national government because they just came out of that power relationship with the King of Britain. So they really wanted to diffuse powers to the states, but we also saw the problems associated with that because we didn't have a national government that had enough authority to rule over those 13 independent states. That's why they got rid of it. We don't have a lot of examples of confederations in modern government, contemporary 21st century government. I guess maybe the thing that comes closest to it is the United Nations, because the United Nations, each of the states is sort of like an equal, it has equal power, and then we have the National Security Council that has this limited power when it comes to security issues. But there aren't a lot of examples, if any, of countries that actually have a confederal system for dividing power. Okay, so this brings us to the federal system for dividing power. And as we said at the beginning when we were defining federalism, we see that federalism is this power-sharing relationship between the national government and the state governments. So you'll see that the power is divided between the national governments and the state governments. And we don't leave it to the states and the national government to figure out what that power-sharing relationship is. The powers are allocated in the Constitution, and we're going to be spending time in a moment taking a look at where we find these divisions of power within the Constitution. And so you'll see the purple circle is the national government, and so there are some powers that are exclusive to the national government. Then you see that there's the blue circle, and that means there are some powers that are reserved to the states and exclusive to the states. And there's other powers, like in that cross-hatched gray area, that indicate that there are shared powers. Taxation is a good example of shared powers. The national government can tax, state governments can tax. They both have that authority. You will notice that the relationship between the local governments, like cities and states, is a unitary relationship. Cities and local governments are servants of the states. They don't have a lot of autonomy, although your textbook talks about this thing called home rule, so make sure that you read about that, because in some states, cities have a little bit more autonomy than in other states. But in most states, local governments are created by the states, they can be dissolved by the states, and they're really there to sort of put into action state law. Although they do obviously have, like with city ordinances, they do have some level of autonomy. And so each, as I mentioned, each of the levels possess some autonomy, some power, national government and state power that is exclusive to that arena. Okay, so why federalism? Why did the framers create a federal system when they were at the Constitutional Convention in 1787? Well, as we talked in the last topic 2, we talked about how the framers were really worried about power being abused, okay? And so they wanted to make a constitution that had certain mechanisms in place that made sure, or at least reduced the chance of power being abused. And they also wanted to have mechanisms in place to sort of encourage cooperation between branches. And federalism places another check on power. It also encourages cooperation to a certain degree as well. So in the last lecture, and we're not going to go over this, but we talked about the two mechanisms, the separation of power, separating power into distinct institutions like Congress, the executive branch, and the judiciary. And then we also talked about checks and balances, that a check on power is making sure that those branches need to work together in order to get anything done, and no one branch can do sort of something unilateral. Federalism provides this another mechanism that places a check on the abuse of power. How does it do that? Well, one thing it does is that it diffuses power. It spreads power out between different institutions and regions, okay? And so just like with separation of powers, federalism gives some powers to the national government and some powers to the state so that power is diffused. So while the national government might be able to abuse its enumerated powers that it's granted in Article 1, Section 3, or Article 1, Section 8, which we'll talk about in a second, separate powers are given to the states. So the chances that both the states and national government are going to abuse their power at least is reduced. It's lessened because power is diffused between the national and state governments. It also has competition between state and national governments. So just as we saw that competition between Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary, and if the presidency was like trying to do something, the executive branch was trying to do something that was just the jurisdiction, the authority of Congress, Congress would push back and say, hey, dudes, get out of our lane. Federalism works the same way. Since states are reserved certain powers and the national government is given certain powers, if the national government tries to do something that is reserved power to the states will push back and say, get out of our lane. Likewise, if the states are trying to do something like coin money that's reserved to the power of the national government will say, stop it, and get out of our lane. And then, of course, the judiciary will step in to answer the question about whether or not there has been sort of power overreach, okay? And then finally, federalism does give opportunity for cooperation. Sometimes states are known as laboratories of democracy, and they get to try out certain policies just at the state level. And then the national government can look at those policies and say, ooh, that policy seems to work pretty good. Maybe we should adopt it at the national level. And so that is also sort of a feature of federalism that's positive. Because we have lots of states and we give states the power, they can try out policies and then we can see if they work. And then we can come up and say, you know what, let's adopt that and apply it to the whole country. Rather than applying something to the whole country that's a failure, we get to see whether it works at the state level. Now, when you're thinking about federalism, you might think, oh God, the division of power between states and national government. Ho-hum, how boring, okay? It's actually, federalism is super exciting to learn about because federalism is really about who has the authority to take action, right? Does the federal government have that authority or do state governments have that authority? And for topic 3, there's a great citizenship and action paper assignment that you can do. It's due later in the semester, but there are these different options you can choose for that paper. And the option this week is to watch a documentary about federalism and sort of the controversies that arise within federalism. And you'll find that by watching that documentary, federalism is really interesting because we're asking ourselves who does have the authority to make policy and who should have the authority. So I just got some pictures there. You got marijuana, right? And so that's been kind of a controversy, right? As we know, marijuana is a banned substance. It's a criminalized substance at the national level, and so national law trumps state law. It's supreme to state law, and so if the national government could, in these states that are legalizing marijuana, they could come in and shut down the dispensaries, shut down the production if they wanted to, but they choose not to at this point. And so states, have passed referendums within in their states legalizing marijuana for medical use and also for recreational use. And so the question is who should have that authority, right? The national government does have that authority because drug production can lead to interstate commerce that can be harmful. So the national government has the authority to regulate drugs between states. But should they have that authority? Is that a proper use of authority? And also, if states want to, within the state boundaries, within their state borders, produce and distribute marijuana within their states, is it appropriate for the national government just to look away and say, you know what, it's in your state, it's not going beyond your borders, we're going to give you the authority to do that. Gay marriage, another really big controversial issue. Up until about 5 or 6 years ago, states determined their marriage policies. And if a state said that you had to be that marriage had to be between a man and a woman, that was allowable. But the national government, and in particular the Supreme Court, steps in and says that denying a same-sex couple the right to marry fundamentally violates their constitutional rights. Okay, so that's another example of how federalism and the question of federalism can be kind of exciting. Gun laws you'll be reading about in your textbook. Even the federal authority to mandate that states have to use and businesses have to use certain kinds of light bulbs and those sorts of things. Okay, do they have that authority? Should they have that authority? So learning about federalism is really fun because it deals with a lot of cool hot topics that we engage in debates over throughout the United States. So I think you'll enjoy that video if you watch it. So as I stated earlier in the lecture, how power is divided within a federal system, that the division of power is outlined in the Constitution. And so the rest of this lecture, we're going to take a look at how power is actually allocated within the Constitution. And here we're going to start with the expressed powers of the national government, okay? And so the expressed powers refer to powers that are exclusive to the national government. They are found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And if you take a look at the Constitution and you look at Article 1, Section 8, there are many, many powers that are granted to the exclusive authority of Congress. Some of the more sort of popular ones, or the ones you might know about, are that only Congress can coin money. States can't be like, we're going to make some Wisconsin currency. It could have a beer and cheese on it or a cow on it or something. No, they can't do that. Only the national government coins money. Only the national government to declare war. Only the national government can regulate commerce between the states and with other countries. Only the national government can raise a national army, punish counterfeiters, etc. Okay? And so there are these powers that only the national government can engage in, and states are prohibited from doing that. So if a state declares war, right, on Canada, like Minnesota declares war on Canada, that's a violation of the Constitution, and they would be prohibited from doing that. Okay, so let's learn about the next type of power that your textbook talks about that's in the Constitution, and it's known as the implied powers. So implied powers are powers that Congress possesses that are not explicitly outlined in the Constitution. Okay, so the express powers, those are the powers that are actually listed, enumerated in the Constitution. Implied powers are powers that Congress has that aren't explicitly outlined in the Constitution. They are powers that are derived from those expressed powers, but these implied powers are not actually listed in the Constitution. That's why they're known as implied powers. Well, where do these implied powers come from? Why do we think that Congress has some powers that are actually not enumerated in the Constitution? Well, at the very end of Article 1, Section 8, and so remember, Article 1, Section 8 are where all the expressed powers are. The very last clause is Clause 18, and that's what's known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. And it states that Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Okay? And so that's a pretty sort of vague statement in a way, and it opens the door. This is something that folks who didn't want to ratify the Constitution got real nervous about, because they're like, whoa, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. That clause basically opens a Pandora's box, opens this door so that Congress can say, I know it's not written in the Constitution, but we deem it's a necessary and proper power that's related to another power, thus giving sort of wide expanse of powers to Congress. Now let's take a look at some concrete examples of how Congress has used its implied powers to bring this idea of the necessary and proper clause to life. Okay, so let's take a look at two court cases, Supreme Court cases, that provide really good examples of the implied powers of the national government. And the one case, both of these are, McCulloch versus Maryland is referenced in your textbook. But these are two really good examples of the use of the necessary and proper clause. Okay, one of the cases is from 1819. The other case is a more contemporary case from 2012. Okay, so McCulloch versus Maryland is this cool case that has to do with whether or not the national government has the authority, or whether Congress specifically has the authority to establish a national bank. And so in 1816, Congress chartered the second bank of the United States. It created this national bank. And then it's put the branches of some of these banks in states. And in particular, they had one in the state of Maryland. And the state of Maryland didn't like it. They didn't like that there was a national bank there and that they worked there. And they actually passed a tax on the bank because they were irritated that this national bank was in their state. And so they sued the national government, basically saying, you know what, there's nowhere in Article 1, Section 8 does it say that the national government has the power to establish a national bank. Show me where that is enumerated, okay? So the question before the court was, does Congress actually have the authority to establish a national bank? And what the Supreme Court in a unanimous decision said is that yes, Congress does have the authority to establish a national bank. That there, because of the necessary and proper clause, there are powers that are granted to Congress, coining money, regulating commerce, the power to tax. So there's all these sort of like commerce and economic related powers that are actually enumerated in the Constitution. And so basically, they took those expressed powers and stretched them in order to say, we have this implied power to establish a national bank. And the Supreme Court of the United States agreed that establishing a national bank was one of the implied powers of the national government via the necessary and proper clause. A contemporary example of implied powers is the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius. Kathleen Sebelius was the secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. This case is a famous case because this is the case that called into question the Affordable Care Act that was passed into law in 2010 during the Obama administration. And everybody was really pissed off about that. In the Affordable Care Act, it said that it required most Americans to purchase health insurance. And if they didn't purchase health insurance, there would be a penalty for it, right? You'd basically get fined for not having health insurance, right? And so the question came before the courts was, does Congress even have the power to require most Americans to purchase health insurance? There's nothing in Article 1, Section 8 that gives Congress that power. Do they actually have that power? And again, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, that they it could have been 6-3, so fact check me on that. That the Supreme Court said that yes, Congress does have the power to require people to get health insurance. They basically said that Congress has the power to tax. Penalizing somebody for not having health insurance is a tax. And so therefore it kind of is, that penalty is an extension of that express power of taxation. And so that stretching thing that I'm talking about, stretching the powers of commerce and coining money to include the power to create a bank, stretching the power of taxation to include penalties associated without having health insurance. Sometimes the necessary and proper clause is referred to as the elastic clause, right? Like a rubber band. And that's because the federal government can stretch its expressed powers in order to create sort of a new implied power. So I know it's a hard concept to understand. So if you have any questions about it, come to Zoom office hours because I'd love to talk more about the necessary and proper clause. Okay, so we have a good idea of what the powers of the national government are. But what about the powers of state governments? This is a power sharing relationship, isn't it? Federalism, sharing power between the national government and the state governments. Well, what powers do the states have? Well, the powers that states have are what are known as reserved powers. And where we find the reserved powers is not in the body of the Constitution, not Article 1 through 7, but we find it in the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Okay? And the 10th Amendment is basically, that's where we find the reserved powers. It's basically saying that if the Constitution says only Congress can do it, or if the Constitution says states can't do it, okay, then everything else are powers that states can engage in. And they're oftentimes referred to, like, colloquially, okay, and they talk about this in your textbook as police powers. And when you see the word police powers, it's not like the power of the police, law enforcement. It's broader than that. Police powers mean the coercive powers to regulate the behavior of citizens. And that the reserved powers are oftentimes thought of as police powers. That states have that power to regulate the behavior of the citizens that live in their states. So when it comes to health laws, such as masking mandates, right, or vaccination mandates, when it comes to safety, okay, having to do with speed limits on roads or safety standards for buildings, when it comes to morals, when it comes to marriage laws, like how old do you need to get married? Can you marry your cousin? When it comes to licensures and the license practices that you need for law or for beautician or for massage therapist, okay? All of that is reserved to the states. And so a lot of the policing power is criminal law, okay? States are the ones, the vast majority of crimes are defined by state legislatures, that when you commit a crime, you're 90% of the crimes that are committed in the United States are infractions of state law, not federal law. And the vast majority of health standards, right? Do you need to wear pants in public or wear shoes, or, the safety of restaurants, the health of restaurants? All of that is reserved to the states, okay? And so, the states have a lot of power. A lot of it is this coercive power to regulate the behavior of citizens. And the thinking is that, States can decide for themselves what kinds of behavior should be allowable, what kind of behavior should be prohibited, and because they best know their citizens, right? And also that because of the Constitution, the states, are reserved these powers through the 10th Amendment. The last thing I'll say here is notice that the powers of the state come from an amendment to the Constitution. And that was a product of compromise. As you read in your textbook, once the Constitution was crafted, it was sent around the states for ratification. And once states started looking at the 7 articles of the Constitution, they got nervous. They said, wait a second. There are not enough breaks in this Constitution on the powers of the national government. And also, where are the rights of states? Where are the explicit rights of individuals? And so basically they said, look, if you want us to ratify this Constitution, you got to do something right after it's ratified. And that thing you got to do is you need to create a Bill of Rights. And James Madison agreed to that. He was, one of the writers of the Federalist Paper. And he said, you know what, states, you ratify. And one of the first acts of the new Congress will be to craft the Bill of Rights. And that's what they did. And that's for next week what we're going to be looking at when we get to civil liberties. Okay, so that's it for today. The next slide will just show you what we're going to be covering in the next lecture. Okay, so hopefully you have a better understanding of how power is divvied up within our Constitution between the national government and the states. And in the next lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the changing relationship of federalism. In other words, the changing relationship between the national government and the states. Thanks a lot for paying attention. Talk to you again soon.